today. It's my great honor to welcome a brilliant panel to join me to celebrate the publication, a monumental book by Professor Stevan Harrell. Steve is an anthropologist and a retired professor from the University of Washington in Seattle. And after publishing many important books on Chinese minorities, ethnic studies, and he's publishing, he's showing us right now this beautiful and it's not clear for some reason, my screen. This heavy, dense book, which is entitled A Ecological History of Modern China. The book was published earlier this year by the University of Washington Press. So we're here welcome three panelists, Professor Jesse Rodenbiker from the Department of Geography at Rutgers University, and Professor Robert Weller from Boston Anthropology Department at Boston University, and also historian and Qing historian, environmental historian Peter Perdue from Yale University, the history department. So these scholars are from very different disciplines, a very different training background, but they've all read Steve's book very, very carefully. So they agreed to gather here to talk about this book. What a great privilege for all of us to hear this wonderful panel. I just want to quickly mention this. Steve will give several other book talks and panel discussions about this book. Today is the very first event. For those of you, if you're willing to hear other panel discussion, other book talks by Steve in different parts of the world. As I know, one will be in Brazil, the other will be, several will be in Europe, right? So they will take place according to different time zone. The event's gonna take place. So Steve have, if you are willing to participate more of those events, you may use the personal email that Steve has already posted in the chat box at the top of the chat list. You may find his personal email. You may reach out to him to ask about the contact registration information for future events. Okay, so so this is my very brief introduction to our panel and our panelists. I'm not going to waste more time. So let's just dive in to today's event. So today's event will be structured in this way. The book's author, Stevan Harrell, going to give us a very short but important introduction to the talk. Then we will turn to our panelists for their comments and for their questioning section. And then so the author will respond to the comments for a few minutes. We will have a little free debate discussion among the panelists. By the time we turn to 12:15, we will try to close up the discussion and then offer the rest of the time to the audience to bring up your comments and your inquiries. Okay, so if you have any thoughts, any question, any critique, either about the book or to the book talk or to the panel discussion, please reserve to the last 35 minutes. If you want, you can also type out your comments and question in the chat box of the Zoom, in the Zoom system. All right, so here we will, I'm gonna end here. Steve, I'm gonna turn to you.
Well, thank you so much, Ling. I want to first, before I begin, just to express my thanks to the Fairbanks Center and particularly to Ling and to Mark, who has put this remarkable internet event together, and also, of course, to Rob and Peter and Jesse on the panel. So I'm going to share the screen now. And that's my background, of course. And I put the PowerPoint on show and hoping that everybody can see that. Can people see that?
No.
Oh, still have to share. Sorry. How about that?
Good.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. As I say, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. And in talking about China, I just want to mention two things. And so I can move my slides here. The first thing is we have to remember that China is a repressive regime and is putting innocent people in prison for life sentences. I'm going to say a lot of good things about China in this talk, but I don't want people to forget that, especially during the sad time. The second thing about China is, even though I wrote way too long, as Ling has said, a really heavy, dense book, you can't get everything in. So what do I find out this week? Tourists are ruining oceanside environments by digging clams with unsustainable methods. That didn't make the book, and it's one of thousands of things that didn't make the book. Well, what did make the book? Well, it started out in 2007 when a conference invitation came from Zhang and Joe Eschrich at UCSD for a conference called Paradigms Influx, New Perspectives on Shifting Grounds in Chinese Studies. And of course, they would have a conference volume. And so I wrote a rather dense and speculative paper on thinking about how to write Chinese history, not so much centered around or focused on elite politics or policies or, what Mao said last week, but rather on how the ecosystem developed and changed. And it was one of many, I think, pretty innovative approaches to Chinese history. And I greatly look forward to the conference volume. And so they decided not to have one. So maybe I should shorten it and publish this in a journal. And I asked several friends, including the indomitable, indefatigable Eugene Anderson. And he said, "Oh, no, Steve, don't shorten it for an article, lengthen it, write a book." And so a decade and a half later, here is this heavy, thick volume that Ling mentioned. So I want to go through the structure of the book briefly and then raise some questions. With regard to the structure, I tried to introduce several different kinds of key concepts that would help us to understand history in this ecosystem perspective. And a lot of them, but these three I think are the most central to the argument of the book. The first one is what the great biological anthropologist James Wood at Penn State called Malthus and Bosrup ratchet, by which, as we see the expansion of a human society, what happens is that eventually the technology and the labor and capital and material inputs that go into this start to produce diminishing returns. And when they produce diminishing returns, the society gradually slides, or even more rapidly slides, from what Malthus called a condition of plenty into what he called a condition of misery. And this is where the Bosrup part comes in. The society doesn't sit there and starve, but it increases the technological, the material, the labor inputs, and in other words, intensifies production. And as it intensifies production, it works for a while, the society goes back into a system of plenty, but that too produces diminishing returns as population continues to increase, and then we go back into a condition of misery. And so this, through various turns or repeated turns of the Malthus and Bosrup ratchet, we have a series of slides back and forth during the course of Chinese history. The second one is the relationship between ecosystem resilience, or the capacity of an ecosystem to absorb disturbances and continue functioning, and the productivity of the system. As the productivity goes up with the Malthus and Bosrup ratchet, then at the beginning of the curve, usually productivity and resilience increase in direct relationship to one another. For example, if you've been farming a hillside, you got lots of erosion that's unstable in case of rains and so forth. It's hard to irrigate, but if you build terraces, this is a increases the productivity, but it also increases the resilience, because if you do have a rainstorm, then it won't necessarily wipe out the crop on terraces as it would if you had it just on an unterraced slope. So eventually, as productivity increases, resilience drops. The system becomes more and more vulnerable to disasters. And we see the kind of thing that we saw, for example, during the last 120 years or so of the Qing dynasty. The third concept is the idea that when a society has met its challenges and increased its productivity by building infrastructure, it thus becomes dependent on that infrastructure, raises the maintenance costs of that infrastructure, and the infrastructure typically brings about a certain environmental degradation, or even certain environmental disasters if it exceeds the threshold of its resilience. And so what developmentalist regimes typically do, rather than removing the cause of environmental degradation, the thing that fixed it, and if the thing that fixed it goes wrong, rather than removing it, they add another fix on top of the fix. So we see over and over again in the history of modern China, the fix to fix to fix. Well, using this kind of concepts, the first thing I do is to take a tour of China's social ecological systems, divided into three zones. I borrowed the term zomia from, of course, from Jim Scott, who borrowed it from Willem van Schendel. And you see in the map that these zones are kind of blurry and very generalized, but they're really three different kinds of human adaptations to and in the environment. And in order to understand China as a whole, we really have to understand it in terms of the characteristics of these three different systems. The next thing that I deal with in the book is the original paradigm that I introduced at the 2007 conference, which, as Peter's pointed out, of course, he was there too, to try to not displace, but perhaps superimpose a ecological periodization on a conventional politics and policy periodization of modern Chinese history. And one of the things I think I was most concerned with at this time was, especially in 2007 when that conference happened, the modern Chinese history was all Cultural Revolution centric. It was written by victims of the Cultural Revolution or foreign friends of victims of the Cultural Revolution. And of course, the official history was that the Cultural Revolution was a big mistake, 10 chaotic years and so forth. And so that's a pivot between the reasonable progress of state socialism. Of course, they ignored the grand tragedy of the Great Leap Forward, and then the modern triumphalist idea of Gaiga Kaifang. Well, I thought, yes, this is true, but there's other ways to look at it. And I was particularly concerned with the idea that the Cultural Revolution period was not really very different in ecological or ecosystem terms from what came before. And it wasn't even all that different from what came afterwards. We shifted the economic system, of course, from state socialist to something people call state capitalist or bureaucratic capitalist. But the effects on the environment, they may have accelerated a little bit, but they really weren't very different. And so I put the turning point here at around 1998 with the most damaging floods on the Yangtze River. And when the state began to take environmental protection seriously, it would always paid attention to it to a certain extent, but it was always, whether under a socialist regime or whether under a state capitalist regime, it was always taking second place to development. But as Mary Alice, who's here, and I pointed out in the introduction to another recent book, all the states in East Asia, including China, have gone from a pure developmental set of goals and set of policies to what we call eco-developmental policies. So I tried to superimpose this as not a substitute, but an additional way of looking at the course of history of the PRC. Okay, so then I tell the story twice. I tell the story first in terms of what I call land, water, and food, and divide this into different periods and talk about the different phenomena as foci during these different periods. As you see, chapters 3 through 6 are all about agriculture and solving what was probably the most important problem for the Communist Party regime from the start, which is feeding the country. And it took really until the late 1990s that they could feed the country reliably and with a good diet. Then I shift to water and talk about water diversion regimes. And you'll see the map here, one of the 24 beautiful maps in this book drawn by cartographer Lily Crandall-Orrell, who's a grad student now at UBC. And then chapter 8 about dams. So first about channels, then about dams, and then I come back to food. And I talk about the food regime now, where there's plenty to eat, all sorts of things for everybody. And of course, it decreases the resilience of the system in ways that I'll talk about a little bit later on. So then I shift to telling the story a second time, which is about cities and industry, according to the same periods, although I consolidated the 1950s and the Great Leap Forward into chapter 11. And this really brings about the paradox, the biggest paradox of recent Chinese history in ecological terms, which is that China is the world leader in green industry. China's economy has become about a tenth as energy intensive as it was in 1980. It is producing over half of the world's electric cars, installing huge amounts of wind and solar energy and so forth, and still is increasing its greenhouse gas emissions simply because the economy is growing so fast. And that is that's the story of chapter 16, Paradoxes of Eco-Development. And then the conclusion is come back to talk about Chinese history as ecological history, which is maybe some of the lessons that we can learn from the different topics that are discussed here. So I have some conclusions that are, I hope, controversial, and I hope people will push back on them in a productive way. The first one is people are asking, a lot of people working on this now, Li Yifei and Judith Shapiro, Jesse, who's one of our commentators and so forth. There is I can find no generalizable difference between the environmental records or capabilities, or to put it the other way around, the level of environmental degradation that goes on between democratic and authoritarian regimes as long as they are developmentalists. There's so much controversy over this, and I get to look at China, I look at the US, I look at the various European countries, I look at, and was their environmental record? It's better on some things, worse on some things, but we can't draw any conclusion that authoritarianism is great because you can make changes and you don't have to worry about the Republicans, or something like that, or that democracy is great because the government can't ignore the suffering of the people. No, same. The second thing is that, like all expanding economies, China eventually exports its ecosystem degradation. China was, Jesse actually talked to the other day and pushed me to think about this a little bit more, that China in the, and Chris Coggins also, who is editing a Sage volume on environmental history of China that I'm writing a chapter for, that from the early period into the end of the state socialism, China was basically autarkic. It had some crucial imports, had a few exports to pay for them, but economically and in terms of material goods, China was basically autarkic. Then from beginning in 1980 and going up to maybe around the 2000 decades, China was importing environmental degradation. It was doing dirty manufacturing on behalf of wealthier countries, particularly the US and the EU. But since 2010, it's been going the other way. And China, as a wealthy country, has been able to export some of its dirty industry, a lot of its things like capture fisheries and mining to poorer countries than it. So there's been an arc in which China has moved from an importer to an exporter of environmental degradation as it's gotten richer. And then, of course, the third one is pretty obvious. China is both the leading greenhouse gas emitter and the leading builder of green solutions to environmental and climate problems. The paradox here is solved by the fact that it's been growing so fast. And then the fourth conclusion here is more theoretical, is that resilience is knowable only in retrospect. Resilience is the ability of a system to absorb disturbances, but we don't really know whether a system can absorb disturbances until the disturbances have come and we see whether it's absorbed that or not. And so all the dire predictions of environmentalists saying that that so-and-so is going to collapse, our American agriculture system is going to collapse, there's going to be no more soil, this kind of thing, floods are going to overwhelm China. Well, maybe, but we don't know until afterwards, which of course shows us the value of history as a form of inquiry. The other thing, other things that might be fun to discuss, one is the book's political stance. Somebody said that book was on Amazon, and of course, you always look, right, and see all your books doing on Amazon. You don't admit it, but anyway, the first book, first review I saw was, I found this disappointing. A hatchet job on China masquerading as academic work. And this came from an old British socialist whose name I've got somewhere. But I'd been afraid the whole time that this was going to be, I was going to be slammed for being too favorable to China, especially given the political climate in the United States today. So the first thing I get slammed for is for China bashing, which surprised me. And then, of course, Václav Smil, I was just, he's I don't know, Václav, is he here? Probably not. But anyway, I've always admired the heck out of his work, and I was very honored to have a blurb from him. But in his usual, what should I say, direct manner, he has sort of slammed all the recent books on China in the course of praising mine. So this is some things to discuss. Also, questions of historiography. In other words, I wasn't using concepts from political science, literature, and philosophy, but I was using concepts from ecology and population biology to write history. Does this give us a valuable perspective or not? Secondly, I wrote this mostly at home on the internet using mainly scientific papers rather than using documents from archives. Is this still history? Or am I just complete sham because I've never sat in a dusty room in the old imperial palace in Beijing and leafed through memorials? And then, most importantly, and I appreciate people's comments here, especially for my talks in Brazil and then in Portugal and probably fairly soon in Taiwan. How applicable is this kind of analysis to other places, other times, other scales? How significant is, and this was a question I got from my Portuguese colleague, Gonçalo Santos, how is the fact that I'm writing this as an American from an American perspective, how does this influence both the way that I see China and its applicability to other parts of the world? So, aprenez Armanier Dugum de Hundratiet. I can answer that in the chat if you want, or in the Q&A if you want, but I'm really looking forward to the discussion. And I've gone 8 seconds over, so that's it. I will unshare.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you for this extremely rich and yet concise introduction to this 500 pages long book. So before we turn to our panelists, I want to quickly mention the two names that you invoked in your short talk. Li Yifei, a political scientist at NYU Shanghai campus, who co-authored a book with Judith Shapiro in regards to the issue of authoritarian environmentalism, who's going to visit us, gave a talk about his related research later this year or maybe next year. I just want to put this out so people know that who you mentioned here, Steve, will visit us soon. On the other hand, you also mentioned our colleague Mary Alice Haddad, who is a political scientist at Wesleyan University. Mary Alice is also here, and her new book, which is entitled Environmental Politics in East Asia, is fresh off press from the University of Cambridge Press. So Mary Alice kindly offered the link to this new book. If you're interested, go to the chat box. I think the second or third chat was actually offered by Mary Alice, and she also mentioned the download is free for the 2 weeks for these 2 weeks. So I've already downloaded the book. If you're interested, here's a free version for you to download. Okay, now with all this information, let's turn to our panelists. I'm going to call upon Jesse Rodenbiker as our first discussant, and Jesse, you will have roughly about 8 minutes to supply your comments.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. So first, let me say thanks to Ling and the Fairbanks Center for the invitation to be part of the panel discussion today. It's really great to be here. And second, I've got to say thanks to Steve for writing this incredibly well-researched and well-written book. For my comments, I'm going to focus largely on what I see as one of the key interventions for the book and draw out some points for discussion and reflection around questions of scale. The book, in my read, does really important work in periodizing Chinese history by taking ecology as a tool of analysis. The book takes ecology as a tool for analyzing China's modern history and development from the mid-20th century to the present. In this, it departs from much of the work on China's environmental history that focuses largely on politics, economics, and policies while holding the environment as a kind of passive backdrop upon which people act. The book focuses on what the author calls, I quote, a system of social ecological systems, or in other words, ecological history. I'm going to quote here from the early part of the book. I quote, this perspective sees China and its constituent parts as systems of interconnected elements: land, water, air, trees, crops, animals, bacteria, chemicals, people, policies, organizations, laws, literature, film, art, values, and belief, and shows how these elements have interacted over the course of time. End quote. Telling an ecological history, as you can tell from this description, is no small undertaking. Choices abound in how to bound questions of scale and questions of relationality. And here some decisions come into play around scale. So the book analyzes specific ecological zones, elements within these zones, and processes of social ecological transformation over time. The first chapter discusses China as an ecosystem constituted through 3 macro ecological zones. And we heard about these briefly: Central Asia, Chinese Zomnia, and China proper. In analyzing these macro ecological zones, Steve is attentive to cultural and institutional buffers, such as households, village communities, and common pool resource management, as well as to ecological buffers like wetlands, forests, and fallow fields. As I read it, a key intervention of the book is an ecosystemic periodization of Chinese history, according to adaptive cycles where an extensive exploitation give way to conservation and an eventual release and reorganization of social ecological relationships. In brief, this entails transition from a release of social ecological forces to an omega phase of slow growth and social reorganization, to an R phase of steady growth and developmentalism, to a K phase of conservation and eco-developmentalism, roughly where we're at now. This adaptive cycle bears out as an organizational principle and a conceptual intervention for a revisionist ecological history of China. It informs the rendering of China's history as ecological history. So we're presently in this K phase, and the book frames the emergence of ecological civilization as a way for the state to continue to pursue development while at the same time trying to fix its previous environmental fixes. The 7 chapters that make up part 2, as Steve mentioned, are organized around land, water, and food. Chapters in part 3 focus on cities and industry, and each of these parts is recursive, moving back to 1949, working up to the present. So in one sense, this means that the reader can chart China's history through adaptive cycles of transformation in relationship to particular things, in relationship to cities, in relationship to land, in relationship to food, etc. And here I think it's important to bring up the question of scale. And this speaks also to some of Steve's points in his presentation about applying ecological analyses across different places, different times, and at different scales. How might the choice of scale shape how scholars approach ecological history? At one point in the book, China itself is presented as a social ecological system. In other parts of the book, we see different scales of analysis around these 3 macro ecological systems that I mentioned previously: China proper, Zomia, and Central Asia. And here I want to open up a space for Steve to talk about how we could conceive of China as an ecosystem and these 3 different macro ecological zones. I think this will help get a stronger sense for folks for the intervention happening here. And in the future, could we see scholars working on ecological histories of each of these 3 macro ecological zones, for instance? Can we see smaller scales within each of these macro ecological zones as places for framing questions and analyses? So I'm kind of scaling down here from this macro level. In other parts of the book, such as part 3, we see the city scale being mobilized as a unit of analysis. The reader learns about flows of people, sludge, and chemicals through different Chinese cities. Could we envision something like a city-scale ecological history where different municipalities exhibit their own kind of social ecological dynamics? Is there a Beijing-scale ecological history, a Kunming-scale ecological history, a Chengdu-scale ecological history that's waiting to be told? You get the idea here. I'm just trying to pose different scales for the study of ecological history, and I'm putting the question of scale out there for Steve and the other discussants to consider. What might it look like for scholars to focus on China's history from these different scales? Consider one specific land patch, a specific river, a specific animal, for instance, or even broader scaling up, thinking about China's relationship to the ocean as parts of this book engage, or even more broadly for environments outside of China's own borders. Are there potentially innumerable scales of China's ecological history that could be examined? And might the ecological tools discussed and presented on this book, organized around resilience ecology, offer some frameworks and tools for doing this kind of work? So again, here I'm just opening up for the panel and for Steve to consider questions of scale. Steve, maybe if you want to talk about how you thought about scale in relationship to this book, how you framed these macro ecological regions, how you thought about those problems of defining scale as you wrote the book. I think that could be interesting to hear, as well as potentially from the other discussants about what they may see as potential opportunities for different scholars to make different choices around this kind of question of scale. So I'll stop here and pass it on to the next discussant. Again, Steve, a pleasure to engage the book. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jesse. And before we move on to Peter, since Peter going to set up his PowerPoint here, I want to quickly mention here, Jesse, who just supplied the very first comment to our discussion, just recently published your new book. And I want to give a shout out to this magnificent book, which is entitled Ecological States, Politics of Science and Nature in Urbanizing China. And Jesse will visit us early next year. I think it's February next year, to give a talk about that book. So I welcome all of you to participate in that event. Okay, now we will turn to Peter.
Yes, thank you. Let me see. Can you see the slides here?
Yes.
Okay. So yes, thanks to Ling for putting this together. Thanks to Steve for finally producing the book. And thanks to everybody for listening in. I was at the original ESHRI conference in 2007. I had a paper, but I was much lazier than Steve, so it never became a book. But I did see the first draft of Steve's work back then, and I've heard him present it several times since then. I also reviewed the manuscript for the press 2 years ago, and I reread it again for this talk. And amazingly enough, it still has a lot of insights to offer every time I go back to it. And that's, few books have that, I must say. So this has been a long time gestating, this book, but the baby is out in the world now, full of life, and congratulations to Steve, and we can all break out our virtual cigars. I won't try to summarize the book, and I, to my horror, found I have too much to say in too little time, so I will really just have to wave my hands at a number of the points in these slides. I think the greatest originality of his study, especially for historians, is to redirect our attention towards systemic transformations in the relationship between production and environment. It's a powerful argument for attention to ecology as a fundamental component of modern China's experience. It ranks along with Mark Elvin's Retreat of the Elephants and Robert Marx's textbook as one of the key texts everyone needs to read for understanding China's environment. I wanted to say just a few things about periodization, which in time frames, Jesse very nicely brought up geographic scale. I'll talk a little bit about time scale. Second, about bringing the state back in. This is the thing that is noticeably lacking from the book, deliberately so, and what might be done, or should it be done? And what is resilience anyway? I don't know if I'll get to that question, but we could save that for discussion, perhaps. Periodization. Well, Steve outlined that pretty quickly for people. And many things about the periodization struck me. One thing is, for example, the Great Leap Forward as a key period. I've always felt that is the failure of the Great Leap Forward and the Great Famine that came after it. For a long time, actually didn't get a lot of attention in political science and historical studies, but now has been much more deeply researched. But the paradox of the Great Leap Forward and its failure remains. Was it a culmination of efforts to reorganize agriculture around scientific methods, that is hyper-rational, Steve calls it, or was it a completely irrational defiance of natural limits to growth by a cult-obsessed society led by the psychotic Mao Zedong? You can find all sorts of interpretations across the spectrum of the Great Leap. But in ecosystemic terms, it was both, because the Great Leap planners, even those who had technical expertise, were obsessed with only one variable, that is grain yields, and they ignored its impact on the larger system. And this is the key fault in the great book, Panarchy, that Steve relies on, that happens when you don't pay attention to ecosystems. You focus on one variable, try to maximize it, it leads to disaster. Now, this isn't a new obsession of Chinese officials. This was always an obsession, even in dynastic period. I found one curious example that Steve cites, where the State Council in 2020 limited the planting of non-grain crops by farmers, which they were selling to the expanding cities. Well, this reminded me of Qing officials who denounced farmers that used grain to brew wine for urban consumers. It's this condescending view of farmers as somehow sincere but foolish, as if farmers don't know about ecosystems. They know a hell of a lot more than officials do, that they need guidance by the educated elite. This is, in the pre-modern period, agrarian developmentalism. It refuses to allow farmers to make their own decisions. It's exacerbated even worse in the Marxist-Leninist industrial era with its contempt for farmers. So even little curious comments in the books strike a chord with someone paying attention to the Qing dynasty, for example. If we look at other timescales, we could look at a millennial timescale to set this story, say a 4,000-year timescale, because as Steve comments, we are now reaching the end of peasant China. this peasant China based on settled agriculture and farming, replaced by CCCM, as he calls it, consolidated, chemicalized, commercialized, mechanized farming, much closer to the American model, is now taking charge in China. Peasant family farming has been the foundation of the entire Chinese society for at least 4,000 years. It was an agrarian developmental society. Peasants tried to exhaust the resources of the soil. They intensified production as much as they could. And many of the stresses that Harrell points to are just intensifications of these long-term changes, what Mark Elvin called in a famous article, 3,000 years of unsustainable growth. But there was also eco-developmentalism in the past, not just by Taoists, but also by local officials who saw forests, birds, fish, landscapes disappearing and thought this was a threat to actual cultural and civilizational survival. Some even fought against it. For a while in China, many scholars thought ecology was simply a Western import, something you would just fight back as trying to keep China down. But now China's embraced the idea that they need ecological values, they need ecological developmentalism of their own sort, but it's rooted in this longer history of the Chinese peasant family farm. If the family farm is gone in China, what kind of ecological culture will China have? Farmers and ranchers in the US, however, we still idealize the family farm, even though only 1.3% of the total farm population of the US are farmers and ranchers. Organic farms are only 1% of total farming in the US. Well, is China on this road? What is China's future without the peasant family farm? The second element I only briefly mentioned, but you know, demographic decline has begun in China, depending on when you believe government figures, which I don't. I'm more convinced it began about 5 years ago and it's down to 1.2 billion and total fertility rate is probably already below 1. This totally upsets the traditional models that population growth is a good thing, a sign of benevolent government. It also provided corvée labor and soldiers and tax income for powerful states. It's only really in the late 18th century that some people start warning against population pressure. We do know Chinese peasants, however, practiced fertility limitation in their families in the 18th century, partly through infanticide, partly through other methods. Now they're reducing birth rates well below even what the government wants. This will all have huge effects on the environment. It ultimately might be positive, but I think in the short term, it's going to be negative rather than positive for economic growth and the environment, but something to think about. But I don't think it makes Steve's analysis irrelevant. On the century level, we have the Qing dynasty to think about. The reason these three main ecozones are part of China is because of the Qing dynasty, which incorporated the Central Asian and really brought in the southwestern parts of China. And that meant contact with alternative cultures. Zomi and Central Asia provide alternatives to monotonic Han developmentalism, mobility for pastoral peoples and Swidden peoples, attention to natural phenomena, religions and local cultures. In a way, the lost Taoist component of Han culture survived in the frontiers among non-Han peoples, including the Yi people that Steve has discussed so well, of course. So the Qing is deeply involved in this whole concept of eco-frontiers and eco-zones. I noticed, for example, on the internal frontiers, this map of the shrinkage of Dongting Lake, which began back in the 17th century, but continues today, as you can see. And major floods in the Yellow River that occurred in the 1990s were partly a consequence of the tremendous shrinkage, the loss of this huge ecosystem buffer in China. It gets even worse in the late Qing, and that's a period I think we ought to pay more attention to, the last decade of the Qing, which is when the industrial developmental state really kicks in and leads to major scientific, technological investment, high capital investment, exploitations of resources of land and minerals, coal and forests, the invasion or transformation of Mongolia, and other things. So the Qing has a whole story to tell here, which maybe Steve can tell or other Qing historians can tell. But his whole perspective has a great deal to offer us for looking at Qing and other histories, because it takes this systemic approach. the properties of the system get more attention than the specific actions of human actors. And we could benefit a lot by paying attention to this multiple scale of analysis while also telling our stories. I think I won't have time to talk about how to bring the state back in, and we could save that for discussion, but just to add a couple of quick points here. Strategic goals affect ecosystems. Fuguo Qiangbing is the Qing slogan. Economy and military strength are closely connected. So state, military, and strategic planning matters a lot for what it does to the ecosystems. And geopolitics brings in all the international effects, which you can see in the story of dams and their international consequences. And then militarization, which goes along with this strategic planning. The war on nature emphasizes the reliance on top-down standardized solutions, whereas Steve points out, surprises always happen. You need to be flexible. You need to be aware of changing situations. Look at two ways of waging war in Ukraine and Russia. You see what that means, adaptive versus rigid. And finally, what we should talk more about, if we had time, the deliberate self-blinding of the state is quite remarkable. The contrary to Jim Scott's seeing like a state. The Chinese state repeatedly hides information from itself that it finds inconvenient. We know the GDP growth rates are notoriously inflated. Recently, they suppressed youth unemployment rates. The demographic data are excessively high. The COVID death rates were completely suppressed, of course. And these are all features of this rigidity trap K cycle, which the Qing dynasty itself also committed. Qing generals denied that they lost battles. They covered up evidence of disasters. They lost grip on the finance. And fiscal registrations, the Great Leap Forward was another time of magic realism in the data, and we see a lot of it today. Reforestation hasn't been nearly as successful as official sources claim. I think information is a key variable, and it's also a key sign of rigidity when the state itself is not trying to hide this, I think, from the foreign community or even its own people. It's hiding it from its own bureaucracy because there are things it doesn't want to know that would force it to do things. So critical analysis of central government figures, one of my pet peeves. The media take these things at face value when they never should. Steve relies very heavily on scientific articles, fortunately, so we have much more reliable information. But we have to be suspicious of these government figures, but use the whole information structure of the bureaucracy as another sign of whether resilience is going down or not. And resilience, I'll talk about, Steve has said it, only knowable in retrospect. I would add some discussion on what kind of shocks hit the system. I'll say that it's not a single variable. It isn't a predictive variable. This isn't really a theory that's going to predict the future. It's a historical perspective, in fact, and that's why I admire it so much, and I'm so grateful for Steve to bring it to us. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Peter, for this rich analysis and speaking very quickly as a middle period China environmental historian. I would say that if we look into more distant earlier history, we can actually see a lot of resemblance there, such as in the Tang and Song dynasty. Okay, now let's move to Rob Weller of Boston University, please.
Thank you. I'm going to try hard to stay within my little 10 minutes, but as Peter said about his time, I'm going to have to go fast. First, Steve, I'm like blown away that you could do this. Everybody's talking as if 15 years was a long time to produce this book. 15 years was an unbelievably short time to produce this book. It's just the sheer amount of information in it is overwhelming, and that one person, one actual human being could produce that in 15 years is already amazing. And then there's I think, the broader contribution of it, that is, it's an ecological history. It's really a way of rethinking how we normally tell the history of China, but just history, period. And so I think it's crucial. And you asked, is this applicable elsewhere? Of course it's applicable elsewhere if somebody's clever enough to do it, but it means rethinking how we normally approach these problems. So I think in that sense too, the book is kind of a breakthrough. Since I brought up the ecological history thing, and since I'm also not a historian, although maybe I've spent more time in dusty archives than you have, Steve, I'm not sure. Is it history? You nervously asked at the end of your presentation. And I guess my answer is, I don't care. It doesn't matter. Is it useful? Does it change how we think about China, about the world? Yeah. So good enough for me. We can defend our disciplinary boundaries in some other context. I don't think this is a book that particularly lets people defend disciplinary boundaries, quite the contrary, and that's a good thing. All right, on to questiony sorts of things. I realize that points I wanted to make overlap a bit, at least with what both Jesse and Peter said, but maybe from a little bit different angle. Somewhere early in the book, you talk a bit about Bill Skinner, and it's where you're talking about scale, right? The issue that Jesse addressed. And so it's not that you're doing a Skinner analysis in any like really literal sense. We're trying to think about China in the way he taught us to think about China, which I appreciated, but it also immediately made me think back to sitting in his class as a graduate student. And I'm sure it's the same class you took, just I took it some years after you did, when he was talking about cities, Chinese cities, and how we can't think of them the way we think of European cities, because they were integrated into rural life in so many more ways that is quite different from the medieval history of European cities. And then thinking about just the table of contents of your book, no further than that, it's kind of divided into rural and urban. Now, not exactly when you actually read the chapters, the so-called urban half, it talks about plenty of non-urban things, in fact. Nevertheless, there's a split between the city and the countryside there. And I just wonder if you would want to talk a bit more about why you decided to make the cut that you made. And if you think it's a valid distinction between urban and rural, like where do we draw the line? What's urban? In particular, because the PRC keeps reconceptualizing its own ideas about urban, what counts as a city, how much countryside is inside a city, how are areas governed, at what point do you become an urban shaoqu or a rural xiang, right? These kind of questions that are constantly shifting in China, actually. So I wonder if that might be something you want to address today or someday. So Peter, moving to a Peter point, this state, what is this state of which you speak? And I also appreciate the fact that you haven't written a political history of China. We have political histories of China. That's not right. That's not the niche that you're filling here. Nevertheless, the state matters. You talk about the state a lot because you have to for this topic. My impression overall in the book is that your vision of the Chinese state is a very Jim Scott seeing like the state that modernizing, scientificizing, right? That kind of a state. And that certainly captures a lot that goes on, and yet it doesn't capture a lot that goes on, like differing interests within the state, which I think is what leads to Peter's point about not seeing like a state, right? The state that can't see itself. It's because the state really isn't a singular thing at all. They're different competing interests, which benefit possibly in different ways from revealing information and hiding information. But I wanted to suggest yet another vision of the state, really based on an MIT dissertation by Jamie Wong that I was just on the committee for, where she says, at least since the Deng Xiaoping period, there's been an aspect of the state which is also just massive trial and error. She compares it to a like machine learning state. You just try everything in order to figure out what works. And this was, in a sense, the beginnings of the responsibility system in agriculture, for instance, and many other things. The reason laws are so loosely formulated in China is partly to let everybody mess with what's possible within that, and then decide what the model should be. So it's a rather different understanding of how a state can work than the usual top-down kind of a one. So I guess, like Peter, wonder if you could expand on just what kind of state you think we're dealing with here. And then resilience. I kind of wish Peter had taken more time to talk about resilience, because I'm pretty sure he could do it better than I can. I've always gotten a little bit nervous by the concept. And I have to say, for those of you listening who have not read the book, at the beginning, there's a kind of discussion of these basic ecological concepts that was on one of Steve's early slides today, which is super useful. Like if you just are teaching a general environment course, that one chapter alone would be worth assigning to students. But so resilience, my issue with resilience is it always sounds like equilibrium to me. And obviously it is related to equilibrium. And you do have a discussion in there of how it's not exactly equilibrium ecology, because, what happens if you lose resilience, you flip over into some other kind of equilibrating state. So yeah, it complicates it a bit, but still there's an equilibrium concept at its heart. So why does this matter? Like a difference between an equilibrium view of the environment that we live in, or the way we live in the environment, and a disequilibrium view of it. If you're a policymaker, it's a huge difference. Like if it's supposed to be equilibrium, I kind of know what to do. If it's disequilibrium, what are we even trying for? What are we doing? I don't know what to do as a policymaker, which I think brings me maybe to one of your most interesting points that you brought up briefly and Peter brought up briefly, which is in the conclusion where you say, we only know resilience after the fact. So I think that's actually a very important point to make. And I kind of like the way Peter said it, that, it's a historical judgment. But again, if we're making policy, how do we make policy if we only know resilience after the fact? Is that throwing up your hands about policy? So if you want to, if you'd be willing to address that, what is policy and how do we do it? And finally, really quickly, just one last point that the others didn't bring up, but since you know my work on this, you won't be surprised to hear it, but we have this gigantic transformation of attitudes toward the environment mostly in the 21st century, especially, in the 21st century. The fad for organic food or alternate food sources that you talk about in chapter 10, the tolerance for demonstrations that involve environmental issues or food quality issues, those kinds of things. What happened? What changes people's attitudes? So you have this Kuznets curve discussion, which just seems to imply there's some GDP per capita level, and then magically we have environmental awareness. Well, so how does that, if that's it, like, how does that work? We're talking about actual people with brains and not just bank accounts. What happened? What made people aware? It's not just that there was a giant flood in 1998. That wasn't the first environmental disaster in China. It's not just that the cities were polluted. It's not just that the food supply felt very unreliable to people. All of that had been there all along. So just how does consciousness change? How does environmental consciousness change? So let me leave it at that. And thank you again for writing this wonderful thing.
Thank you so much, Rob. Okay, so now we're going to move to the next round of discussion that will begin with a response from Steve. Steve, I'm going to give you very generously up to 8 minutes. How's that? How generous is that for you to pick up something to reflect on?
Well, I'll just race until I reach the finish line, and then I'll stop. It's just like in Alice in Wonderland. Jesse's question about scale is a vexing one. It's been a vexing one for me all along, because I did start out, and I still consider myself an ethnographer. And I have considered writing an ecological history, and I've written several articles, co-written with my ecologist and geologist colleagues of a very small system. One valley that has 2 villages in it in Yanyuan County in Liangshan, Yizhu Zhizhou in the southwestern Sichuan. And eventually, originally, when I was planning the book, I thought that there would, I would do different scales for different chapters. And that kind of got wiped out because I kept thinking I need to include more, And rather than have a book that's all about examples, it tries to be more comprehensive. But I really do think that when you look at different scales, you see different things. And one thing I would like to point out is the example here of environmental justice and zones of sacrifice. This is particularly true with mining and oil extraction or coal, fossil fuel extraction, where or even sometimes even green energy projects, where a small and usually politically powerless or almost powerless population sacrifices itself for the greater good, supposedly the greater good of the country. We have enough oil to run our cars, we have enough coal to run our factories, and we get wiped out in a local area. And there are a lot of examples in this book, and the sort of the people of color environmental justice discourse really tells us a lot about this. Back to Dr. Rahile, that in my slide, Xinjiang has become a zone of sacrifice for Chinese chemical and petroleum and world trade exports. But a village can become a zone of sacrifice if it has a lead mine or something else of that sort. So things really do work differently at different scales. And what I would recommend people read is a very technical article by the ecologist Simon Levin from Princeton, The Problem of Scale in Ecology. It's in the journal Ecology in 1992. With regard to Peter's comments, Peter has been such an incredible partner, and we've done some projects formally together, but in many ways it's been just sort of, bouncing ideas off of each other over the last 20 or so years. And so the book wouldn't have been a book without his input at several stages. Couple of things that I would like to talk about. The question of the Great Leap Forward, was it hyper-rational, as I suggested in an article that I wrote in Human Ecology with Denise Glover, or was it irrational? And this reminds me of the horseshoe model of U.S. politics, where you can have Noam Chomsky, joining force with the Freedom Caucus to try to oppose the aid to Ukraine. Left and right meet each other closely in a horseshoe, and I think that's true with when rationality divorces itself from empirical observation, as it did in a Great Leap Forward for a series of reasons. Some of them having to do with statistical reporting, some of them having to do with political pressure and the purges of the anti-rightist campaign that immediately preceded the Great Leap Forward. Then rational, hyper-rational and irrational are really the same thing. And what they share is a lack of attention to empirical reality. And, I've always thought of myself as an empiricist. So I am particularly critical of these two ends of the spectrum. Condescending toward farmers, this is a really interesting thing. But I would like to make what I hope is a provocative comment, which is the Cultural Revolution was a counter trend to this. All the intellectuals who were sent to the countryside were to learn from the poor and lower middle peasants. Now, this was ideology. This wasn't practice. They didn't really learn much from the poor and lower middle peasants. Some of them did. I've talked to some who, I learned how to breed sheep. That was the greatest thing when I was sent down. But on the whole, I think that the Cultural Revolution may have been Mao's realization that this condescension toward farmers, and after all, he came from a farm family, was counterproductive. The end of the peasant China and the adoption of the American big ag model, this I think may be the biggest change at all. But I will just, and in this case, Peter suggests, I think, that ecological civilization, is a nationalist discourse. a part of the same nationalist discourse that's reacting to the century of humiliation in many different ways. We invented ecological civilization. The West is heading headlong toward ecosystem disaster. I will mention that my book after next is about the family farm, but here in Whatcom County in northwestern Washington. I've been actively interviewed an 88-year-old dairy farmer yesterday. Demographic decline is something I want to write about. Seeing the human population boom, which of course was the great threat to the planet, only a few decades ago, and now the great threat to the species is that we're not increasing. But if you look at population biology, you see a lot of this in predator-prey cycles. For example, a pest species, something like northern pine beetle or the spruce budworm breaks out, and then it kills all the trees. Well, what it's killed when it kills the trees, of course, it's killed its own food, and then so the species crashes. This is happening to humans. It's on a longer time scale because humans are a longer lived organism than a pine beetle or a lemming or some other species that has these population eruptions. But it's happening, and I think on the century scale, it's a good thing. 2.5 billion people on Earth when Peter and I were born, and now 8 billion was too many. It'd go a couple of centuries to go back to 2.5 billion. As I say, if AIs don't take over and kill us all in the interim, and it'll be a much more stable kind of a system. And finally, the Qing dynasty. Peter's probably the only one here who's read that chapter that was cut from the book. It was about 20,000 words. It's the previous turn of the Malthus and Boserup ratchet at kind of the same scale. It's interesting that the population in the Qing increased about 2.5 times from the founding of the Qing to the Taiping Tianguo. And the PRC population has now increased about 2.5 times. So it's really interesting to look at those as a parallel. And this brings up, Ling actually made a comment here, which she said she wasn't going to, but I'm glad she did, which is to say, it'd be fun if you and Peter and I could write a sort of a general article about middle period China. Maybe get Brian Lander to write early China and write about these cycles over the really macro course of Chinese history. That would be a really fun project for us to think about. Finally, the self-blinding of the state comes back to Joe Esherick, who was one of the co-organizers of the original conference. I quote him somewhere as talking about the transparent fiction of Marxist-Leninism. The idea that Marxist-Leninists know damn well that they're lying, and they're lying in service of a higher purpose. But it becomes a rigidity trap. As a side note, I'm not as suspicious of government statistics as Peter says I should be, and I think he's probably right. I should be more suspicious. Finally, Rob's comments. Everything I do intellectually is a homage to my great teacher and who I'm, was scared of and sort of running from my whole life, G. William Skinner, and so I suppose that this scale thing here, and the cities and urbanization, and I think that I may have addressed that though. Rob asked, how I wanted to. Why did I divide it this way? Well, the reason I divided the book this way, it was just too overwhelming to try to write everything that happened, rural, urban, industry, agriculture, water, food, urban heat islands in one chapter. I couldn't get my small mind around it. So it was just much easier to try to do it twice, to sort of break it down and simplify it so I could understand it or try to understand it. I think that the answer to this is that in the cities part, I do treat urbanization as a process. And that, of course, involves not only the transfer of people from the countryside to the city, but the consequent end of the family farm that Peter's talked about, but also the transfer of land itself from grain farming to vegetable farming to migrant communities like Zhang talks about in her book, to skyscrapers. And this is always a process. I visited the Skinner's Field site in outside Chengdu a few years ago. It's not outside Chengdu anymore, right? It's inside Chengdu. So treating it as a process, I think, but maybe I didn't do enough of, didn't clarify that enough about. The other question of goes Rob talking about Peter's point about what is the state, and I see Jonathan is here, and he's always pushed me with this question about what is the state. A Jim Scottian modernizing state at the continental scale, but different interests of different state actors. And I would think we should re-examine there's a scholarly discourse that spilled over into popular journalistic discourse about China would be fine if it weren't for the corrupt local officials. The Tsar really has the mujiks, in his kind bosom, where he's going to, take care of them. It's these horrible apparatchiki who are messing it up, and this is obviously way too simplistic a discourse. But I do point out in many ways how there are what do we call it? Counterproductive incentives. That's not the right word. But for local officials to undertake environmentally positive or resilient possibilities. The question about from the machine learning state, the only way I think I would argue with from this dissertation that I would like to look at is it doesn't start with Deng Xiaoping. It starts with Mao, always experimenting. Even the original collectivization, or even you go back before that, the land reform, started in a Mongolian autonomous region or autonomous government in 1947, and then reapplying these lessons since and the strategy is called You Dian Dao Men, from points to surface. And so I think this is something that is that goes back. And perhaps Peter could tell us whether the Qing government was actually doing the same thing or not. More time to talk about resilience and equilibrium ecology. I think that it would take a whole session to talk about that. So I will only make one comment, is that the resilience paradigm in ecosystems ecology is an attempt to get away from equilibrium, an attempt to get away from the idea that systems are self-regulating back to a point of harmony, we'd call it, and that the people who developed this, such as particularly Buzz Holling and Lance Gunderson, were really reacting to the Clementsian equilibrium ecology, which was really the first scientific ecological models that were put forth in the early 20th century. Resilience is knowable in retrospect. So if we're making policy, how do we know if we're making resilient policy? You got to guess. I mean, resilience is only knowable in retrospect, but it's probably guessable in prospect. You may be wrong, but you can make better or worse guesses. One more, which is that the transformation of attitudes toward the environment, the environmental Kuznets curve. I like to take this and use what's useful in it. A lot of people just like to reject it because it has flaws, but I think this is a case of the economists doing the same thing as Peter says the Chinese state has done. That is, say, the economists, by depending on some sort of arbitrary thing with gross domestic product per capita, the economists have blinded themselves to their own insights. And I will leave it at that. And Ling, I don't know if you're just telling me to stop or if you had a question.
Yes, I actually want you to stop, but I did want you to respond to Rob's question about changing attitudes. I'm glad you did that. So I would like to give 10 minutes to Jesse, Peter, and Rob to put in some more thoughts and or extra additional response to Steve's responses. Yeah, please go ahead.
Sure.
Yeah, Jess.
I'll just keep it very brief because I know that we want to save time to open up for audience Q&A too, and we're kind of running low on time. So I'll just say two things really briefly. One is in response to one of Steve's comments that he made during the presentation, which was essentially that this is a kind of work that can be done from behind a computer, looking at extant work. I thought this was somewhat self-depreciative because I see this book opening up a space for larger and more expansive kinds of collaboration. So China presently is an incredibly data-rich place. The types of works that humanists and social scientists can do, partnering with environmental scientists who are asking these same kinds of questions in their everyday work, I think the potential for this is huge. So in some of my own work, I look at restoration ecologies and how Chinese scientists recreate ecological records, how they create ecological history in places like the Lake Dian Basin in Kunming. And there are many scientists doing this kind of work. So thinking about the types of work that this book engages, even expanding that and thinking about the ecological histories that are being put together and collated by different groups of Chinese scientists, I think can open up a whole new realm for doing research collaboratively. That's one point that I wanted to make, kind of expanding on Steve's point. And then a second is just responding to a couple of Robert's prompts. Robert, I wonder if you can think of a state that aims to fix the previous fixes as a kind of trial and error state. Is that kind of framework, what you called the machine learning state, something that can fit within to the state that fixes the fix from the previous environmental fix that didn't work? Just posing that, putting that out there, and then thinking a little bit about your prompts around what constitutes policy and how do we think about resilience and that kind of urban-rural dynamism. A lot of what I've seen and part of what I read in this book and engage with in my own work is the ways in which the state tries to produce forms of socio-natural optimization. This can take the form of a fix. It can take a large-scale modeling and essentially trying to optimize these relationships between the city and the countryside, between agricultural production and consumption, et cetera. And a lot of what this has produced in recent years is this widespread urbanization drive. And then these people on the peri-urban interface or the rural-urban interface are essentially navigating these state policies of socio-natural optimization. So this is one way that I think those dynamics between the urban and the rural are continuing to transform. I'll leave it there and give space for others.
And since Jesse called on Rob, would you like to say something, Rob, here? You're muted.
I am not muted anymore.
Oh, good.
Sure. That was very interesting, Jesse, the tying the fixing fixes to the machine learning thing. But it's so thinking about it makes me think in two ways. One is it's always a dynamic. So even the machine learning thing at some point turns into, okay, this is the fix. So let's say this is the fix to Chinese agriculture not getting very far during the Cultural Revolution. The fix is a responsibility system. And it's an experiment. And then it's a highly recommended model. And then it's, you must do it this way, no matter who you are, no matter where you are, no matter how good you were at collective agriculture. So there's that interplay of fixing fixes and then experimenting again. It is an interplay. So is machine learning fixing fixes? Yeah, kind of. So my dam is silting up. What do I do? That's the kind of rigidity trap that Steve talks about a lot in there. But my agriculture isn't working very well. There's a big cost. I don't know how to compare it to a dam, but there's a big cost in moving from collective agriculture back to household-based agriculture, or the other way around. So anyway, I think that's a really interesting way to think about it, to try to pull those ideas of Steve's plus the machine learning one together and see where you get from that. For am I just taking my minute here, Ling? For the resilience one, I mean, we don't have time to have a fun discussion about this, but I wonder if, so I think partly of resilience as this kind of late functionalist discussion in anthropology. Like we all know the problems with functionalism, which was an equilibrium theory. And then in the 50s, we got all these people trying to salvage it. Edmund Leach and Political Systems of Highland Burma, or something that had multiple equilibrium states and you could shift from one to the other. I always thought of it as a kind of attempt to salvage functionalism while keeping many of its basic insights. And so aren't we really seeing that? But then I think maybe more fun to play with, if it's guessable, not a word I think you used in the book, if resilience is guessable, so now I want to know how to guess, like what are the criteria? I still want to know how to make policy. All right, I will stop here.
Okay, I would just this remind me something. I feel like we stage, we host many events, but we don't normally sit down together with each other to talk about these basic conceptual issues. For instance, the concept of resilience, right? So this sort of actually the conversation, I think it's worth exploring, should happen at some point. Thank you, Rob. Peter, would you like to add something?
Well, since Rob, both of them brought up policy, I mean, historians don't generally get asked to comment on policy, or historians get criticized by saying, all right, you've told us all these fascinating things about the past. What's going to happen next? What do you say we do next? Well, there is, as I said, there is such a thing as a historical model theory perspective way of looking at the world. It comes from archives, but not necessarily archives. It comes from getting down to what one naively calls facts, like ethnography. So I have been struck in recent times on the commentary on the Russia-Ukraine war that by far the most perceptive and the most popular commentators on what is happening have been historians, by far. Timothy Snyder and Stephen Kotkin and several other military historians are far ahead of all the elaborate international security theorizing that has gone on in the past. Enough said. But and Scott himself had an idea of the alternative to high modernism. So many theorists like predictive theories. This is physics envy. You have a model, it's rational, it works together, you know all the variables, you can probabilistically anyway predict what's going to happen next by predicting the weather. Well, no, you can't. So if you can't, what do you do? Well, the metic approach was Scott's idea, piece by piece, the fox and not the hedgehog. You try to solve immediate problems, and you try to be empirical. Seek truth from facts is a Han Dynasty slogan, actually. China has this in its own tradition, a tradition of empiricism, massive collections of data, which is why we know so much about the environmental history of China. After all, officials cared about collecting all this data and doing something with it. So I think what they did with it in their best days was not try to have a large scale predictive model, but a piece by piece approach and without perhaps any ideal state in mind. Well, maybe they had some ideal Taoist state of nature, but I don't think Taoism was the main thing behind it. It was well, Confucius, benevolence, human welfare. Let's just say increasing human welfare is a reasonable goal to aim for piece by piece. And we don't have to have these high rational models of perfection or the romantic models of wilderness. We have to have a sort of notion of historical process, I think, in order to move in that direction. And Steve has helped us to do that.
Yeah, thank you. I want to make a one-sentence comment here, which is that for every good article out of scientific journals that I cited in the bibliography, there are at least 4 articles taking some economist or some econometrists or somebody's model and applying it to a system in a mechanistic and unrealistic way. So, this, Jesse, I see is nodding. This is a disease right now of Chinese environmental politics, policy, and science.
Okay. Thank you so much, Steve. That's a little bit more than one sentence, but you control the time pretty well. Thank you so very much. Okay, before everybody we're going to open the floor for conversation, for a Q&A. But while everybody preparing your conversation, I just want to quickly mention, because I see some people have to leave, I just want to quickly mention that on Monday in the afternoon, October 30th, we will have another event to talk about the climate risk, talk about extreme weather in China, including extreme weather such as a flooding around Beijing, in Beijing this summer. So our speaker will be Scott Moore from University of Pennsylvania. So if you are interested, please go to the website of Fairbanks Center in the category of events to look for that event. Or otherwise, the other way to do it is, if you're interested in following our series, the series entitled Environment in Asia, you may send an email to me and to tell me to add your name or your email to the my mailing list. So I will send out emails to everybody. So I typed down my email in a chat box just for those who are interested in being included in our mailing list. Okay, now we have a precious 25 minutes for comments and questions. So here's what we're gonna do it. I already see there are 2 questions in the chat box. So we will deal with multiple questions at the same time. So how about this? For those of you who would like to voice your opinion and raise a question verbally, please use the reaction. Is it reaction? The function, Zoom function, to raise your hand so I can see who wants to ask a question. So we will pick up 2 or 3 questions, and offer to the panelists for them to comment on together, instead of to run one question after another. That will take up too much time. Okay, how about this? As the rest of the room are preparing for their question and comments, I'm going to direct all of us to the chat box. So panelists, so here are 2 questions. I would like you to, all of you, to look at these 2 questions. One is by Ogden Ross, who asked the panelists, how would you characterize the massive overbuilding in the real estate sector affecting natural ecologies versus the vacancy rate and bankruptcies due to irresponsible construction tactics of the CCP to boost the economy? And I want us to also look at the second question by Yue Dong to the panelists. Professor Weller brought up the idea of experimenting for what works. What does to work mean at different times to different people? A second question that is related to the first one, resilience is always retrospective. Is this still true if China is examined in the larger human experiences and practices in the whole world? Is it always necessary for China to, quote, grope the stones? So panelists, let's deal with these 2 questions first. Peter.
I'll take just a quick stab on the first one, which has fascinated me, this utopianism. It does have an agricultural analog in the past. There was an empirical strain, I think, of Chinese agrarian officials that tried to follow local conditions, but there was also a utopian strain, like the equal field system, and the idea that there was these great, just, productive agrarian systems in the past that one could achieve, and you could engage in large-scale land clearance projects to achieve them. And then these land clearance projects would then extend to large parts of the country well beyond what the local ecology could support, and then they crashed. And we have repeated examples of this. So booms and crashes. I followed in the tea industry once. booms and crashes are pervasive in the Chinese economy and in the ecological structures on these local levels. And they are led partly by consciousness, partly by belief in these classical theories. Now we have lots of nice modernist theories to replace the old classical theories, but we still have these utopian boom and crash developments. And this is just another one.
Yeah, I would also like to, in response to Dongya's first question, to work means, what you guess is going to work, but there is a huge problem with this Dian Dao Mian, because it may work very well in a Dian, and when you try to expand it to the Mian, you get what Eleanor Ostrom has called a panacea solution. The greatest example of this, of the Great Leap Forward, the so-called Shuanglong Shuangtou Li, the double-bladed, double-wheeled plow, which worked great in Central Asia, where it was tried in Soviet times, and adopted and worked well in some of the arid parts of North China. You put the thing into a rice paddy and it just gets stuck. These experiments are partly to see if they work locally before you expand them, but sometimes they work locally, or they are deemed to work locally because of political pressures on those who do them, and then they get expanded to the whole country. I mean, Mao, in the beginnings of the Great Leap Forward, he went to Xushui in Hebei, and this is where they really had the thing that he christened Renmin Gongshe. They didn't call it that when he went there in August 1958, but these things seem to work, and they expanded to the country without controls. They do it too fast, and it crashes. So there's a real danger there, and probably the real estate is an example of the same kind of a thing. You are emphasizing one variable in the system to the expense of all the others, which comes from the resilience thinking book by David Salt and I can't think of the other author right now. Looking for expanding the variable of expanding the economy, and not looking at the effects in other parts of the system. I have two charts in the Great Leap Forward chapter that talk about Great Leap Forward linear thinking versus systemic thinking, and how this brought about the ecological disasters. Also, I was thinking I could do the whole book just by the diagrams and cut out all the text, and it would make the same argument. It would be a lot quicker.
Jesse and Rob, would you like to say anything to these two questions? Yeah.
Because I was invoked on the experimenting for what works one. So I think that Dongya already kind of foresaw the answer to the question with the question. That is, what does it mean at different times to different people? So the answer is, it means different things at different times to different people. And that's how we'd have to ask it. But among the most important people are the ones who set the limits to what counts as working, right? The policymakers themselves, the state itself. So at any rate, it's a relative answer to that question. I also thought that one ends with an invocation of Deng Xiaoping's going from stone to stone to cross the river thing, which is very much a Jim Scott Métis view of the world, right? That we deal with everything contextually as we need to. So it might not fit with other aspects of what was going on in governance at that moment, but at least that particular slogan is that other view of what a state might be, rather than the modernist state that sees.
I'll just add on to that really briefly. Or were you going to say more?
No, go ahead, Jesse.
Okay, great. Yeah, so thinking to begin with this question of experimenting with what works, and also thinking a bit back to some of Steve's comments earlier and Robert's comments here. Of course, it depends on a particular place and a particular time. And I think if we think about that question now in Steve's characterization of the K-state being this eco-developmental period, I think what that means in terms of plan and policy is a kind of mechanistic approach to socio-natural optimization. Steve was talking about how 4 out of every 5 environmental science ecology papers he was reading was a kind of mechanistic ecology being applied to a particular situation. In terms of plans and the characterization of what the aim of the plan is or what is supposed to work, there's a really widespread mechanistic approach to essentially optimizing socio-natural relationships. So that's what I would say in response to that question, periodizing it in relationship to how the book periodizes the present.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Jesse. And I will encourage our audience to raise your comments and questions if you are willing to. You may turn on your camera and say it out loud in your own voice. Okay, our audience is rather shy, although we have another question come in to the chat box. One of our audience, Reinhard Weinsinger, says, for the last 20 years, the concept of a circular economy is becoming popular. Circular economy is meant to provide a holistic view of ecological conditions and economic development and see the repercussions. Do you see this as a new paradigm that could provide flexibility beyond the current development models? Since we don't have another question, would our panelists be willing to take up this question here? Do you see this as a new paradigm?
I think, yeah, and maybe it is a new paradox in the sense that because of the nature of state reasoning, in a lot of cases, this fix is going to require a fix. In other words, it becomes a new rigid paradigm. Everything is going to be Xunhuan Jingqi. And it's a good idea. And if it's applied judiciously or properly, or with regard to scale, as Jesse has brought up, or with regard to local conditions, then it can be an important break or mitigation of various kinds of things, such as pollution and flooding and other kinds of environmental degradation. The worry is that it will get applied mechanistically like everything else.
Peter?
Sorry.
Yeah, well, I associate that idea originally with Germany. I don't know what Germany, at least in its auto industry, tried to embrace the total recycling of the production line. So a kind of industrial circular model quite some time ago. But recycling in China would be an example of how this potential and danger, I think, could develop. The huge e-waste places now in China. There's a new brilliant science fiction novel about it, actually, where very poor people are hired to go through all the e-waste that China's produced. But the influence of foreign models on China hasn't been brought up very much here. And I think that part of the single variable maximization approach is from taking a foreign target. I mean, the Great Forward took British coal consumption as its target. So often China have found outside itself a foreign model to follow: economic development, military development, the Soviet Union, and others. Eco-civilization they are trying to claim as their own, even though I think there's a lot of foreign influence on it. But what exactly will they make of it? As another foreign import, or even a Chinese export, might be interesting to look at.
So I'll say something in contrast, if that's okay. So I don't so much see circular economy as a new paradigm at all. I think it's circular thinking in the circular economy has been embedded within the types of scientific logics and scientific debates within China, at least since the early 1980s. So if you read folks like Ye who wrote about ecological agriculture, or if you read folks like Ma Shijun, who was a socialist era scientist who became really prominent in the early 1980s, became chairman of the Chinese Ecological Society. They're writing about things like population, land, commodity cycles, how to maximize the circulation of flow and energy. These are essentially circular economy dynamics that have been part of the debate for 40 years now. So I don't really see this as a new paradigm so much as a kind of reconfiguration of the discourse around debates that have been in play for a long time.
If you look at chapter 1 about the ecological economy of the Chinese village or the Chinese household, of which I have about 4 different versions of that diagram of stocks and flows within a village ecology. This is a case of, I would even go back to invoke Joseph Levinson here. When something becomes a concept like Confucianism, then it's already gone as a living, as a fact of life, and becomes a fact of books. And the circular economy was practiced by Chinese peasants and peasants all over the world for thousands of years. And it's only when it's going away that people start to conceptualize it.
Thank you, Steve. And we have a comment, a question from Steve, your own former student, so Loretta Lowe. Loretta, would you like actually to say it to Steve, or do you want me to read out your comments?
Sure. Hi, can you hear me? Hi, Steve.
Yes.
Hi.
Yes, thank you so much for the presentation and also brilliant discussion. Really enjoy it. When I heard, so I know that you didn't have time to get into the resilience, the concept of resilience, but what I find really interesting was, so how do you think people would react to it if they think, okay, the Earth has its own way of recovering? Because currently, I think people are motivated to act and do something and live sustainably because of this apocalyptic, view that the damage that's done is irreversible if we continue doing it. So if you tell people that, okay, actually, I guess if you tell them that if you stop doing it, things are so yeah. I just want to hear what you think how the idea of resilience and equilibrium would influence how people act in terms of environmental behaviors. Thank you.
Well, let me see if I can answer that. Loretta, by the way, is assistant professor of anthropology at Durham University in England, who was my undergraduate student many years ago. There's been a radical critique of resilience by left-wing ecological thinkers who say it's what Rob said, which is another reinvention of British structural functionalism, and a weak excuse for continued capitalist domination of the world economy. This is a radical critique, which I only partially accept. Because the resilience ecologists themselves would, actually applying it or denying that it's any kind of its equilibrium. Sometimes systems have positive feedbacks, which doesn't mean, praise. Problem with this feedback, so a positive feedback in systems theory doesn't mean praise. It means a action that leads to further actions in the same direction. Whereas negative feedback doesn't mean blame. It means self-regulation. And sometimes action leads to negative feedback in which an equilibrium holds. For good or for bad. One of the things that the resilience ecologists have pointed out is that one of the most resilient ecosystems is a brownfield. It's really, really hard to change. So resilience isn't necessarily, good. It may be good. It depends on what you want to be resilient, but it does not deny that sometimes systems respond to disturbances in a positive feedback way, which means sending the adaptive cycle into a collapse phase. And after the collapse phase comes back, a forest gets burned, and then it's going to come back as a forest eventually, but it's not going to come back as the same forest. And, this goes back not only to Karl Marx, but to the anthropologist from whom Karl Marx got inspiration, Lewis Henry Morgan, Rochester, New York, who talked about, history as a helix rather than as a slope of a curve. So I don't accept the idea that resilience is necessarily a conservative concept, although it could be used, or perhaps, if you wanted to say, abused for politically conservative purposes. Now, whether it's going to convince, the Guangda Chunzong, I don't know. There's a real question about how to reach ordinary people. And it may not be the thing, particularly since the resilience has now become a popular concept. And when things become a popular concept, they go from meaning nothing to meaning everything, which is the same as meaning nothing. So I'm not sure, whether it's going to be useful in environmental politics or not.
Do other panelists care to say a few words about the same question?
Just one, I think, since Loretta raised the issue of the apocalyptic thinking, and arguably, but I think you could argue it, visions of a dystopian apocalypse drive people's consciousness of environmental action. I would just put that, in one way, it points very much to the importance of non-material features of the media, of literature, of the imagination, of consciousness, certainly seriously drives people's behavior. And that's, whether you think it's systemic or not, it's a factor you have to bring in. On the other hand, you could just see apocalyptic dystopianism as just another version of apocalyptic utopianism. That is the same sort of ideal models detached from reality, non-empirical. Predictions of disaster are always easy to make, but where is the evidence, that this disaster or another one will actually happen and that we are helpless to do anything about it? So you could incorporate that idea, the critique of utopian non-realist models, into this idea of the influence of the apocalypse.
Thank you, Peter. Any other thoughts, any other questions? If you would like to, you may address that yourself, if you choose to. Or we're going to turn to chat box again. Here's another comment, a comment from Ogden Ross. I'm just going to read this out loud again. As with your farm plow innovation in rice fields, similarly, the NATO tanks have become mired in the Russian minefields, crawling to a stop. While the more adroit ground troops push forward incrementally, perhaps modernism advances rapidly only to be pushed back on its heels, to then push ahead some other way. In the meantime, ecology ceases to be natural in lieu of a man-made neo-ecological methodology. Interesting comments. Anyone would like to say something or anything else you would like to put into our conversation? Yes, please. Reinhard, Reinhard Weisinger, I'm sorry, or maybe I pronounced your name wrong, please.
Okay, it's a difficult name, but I have the following question. You said, you talked about this concept of fixing the fix with fixes or whatever. What is actually the alternative? I mean, is it not that you're always, so to say, confronted with a reality, with problems that arise from reality, economy, ecology, and that you have to deal with it? And so you have to find a solution. And maybe while you develop a solution, you may also think of a longer-term solution, which may not be just a fix, but because you're always confronted with upfront problems, are you not forced to develop fixes to fix problems? And therefore, how can you move out of that trap of fixing fixes with fixes? Oh, sorry.
No, this is a great question. I'm actually using that idea as piling on further technology to fix the problems caused by previous technology. And so I think in particular about dams, and we can talk about that in the Pacific Northwest because dams on the Elhua River are finally removed. They're talking about removing big dams on the Snake River. But if you think about dams in China, Sanmenxia, which was the first big dam on the Yellow River, just upstream of the Great Bend, or rather just downstream of the Great Bend in the Wei River Valley, where downstream where the Wei flows into the Yellow River. This thing didn't work. It silted up. It caused backup into as far as Xi'an, a siltation of fields, a huge accumulation of silt in the Wei River. They had to reroute highways and reroute railroads and so forth. The solution would have been to remove the dam. It wasn't doing what it was supposed to do. It wasn't controlling floods. It wasn't producing electricity. It wasn't giving much water for irrigation. It was causing other problems. I don't call that a fix to fix to fix. I talk about that as removing the fix. In other words, a fix to fix to fix is to build downstream of the Sanmenxia, to build I can't remember right now the name of the other dam, in order to put in a complex mechanism to try to flush the silt out of the river, and instead of removing the cause in the first place. Or the same thing has to do with coal-fired electricity generations. You know, rather than shifting from coal to something else, which eventually you did, but you put a scrubber on the coal. Well, that brings out, that means platinum pollution, because platinum is the catalyst in the catalytic converter on the smokestack. So I'm using this specifically as when you have technology that creates problems, rather than remove the technology, which might in the longer term do what you suggested, you add further technology, which creates further problems. So that's the specific way that I use that.
Thank you very much, Steve. And as I'm looking at the clock, we are 1 minute past the end of our event. And I wanted to quickly echo this one issue. It seems like we constantly run into conceptual issue. How do you define the concepts? How do you deal with the terminologies? And it seems to me this panel makes me feel, even though we are all environmental scholars from different fields in relation to works in terms of empirically about China and East Asia, but we don't normally sit down to use terminologies in the exact same way. We gave different conceptual meanings to the words, to the terms. So I really feel that we should create opportunities for this kind of a more conceptual conversation in the future. With this note, I really, really want to thank all of you. First of all, the audience for joining us today. And I think at the peak hour, we had more than 100 people joining this event, so it's wonderful. And I want to thank our wonderful panelists for contributing your precious time and your very thoughtful opinion to share it with us. And of course, thank you, Steve. First of all, congratulations on this important book. And thank you for writing it. I want to quickly echo Rob's point earlier. I think think a certain part, I think actually the entire book, and specifically the opening part of the book, it can be used individually for not only graduate teaching, but for undergraduate teaching. So this is a great, great contribution to the field, not only intellectually, but also pedagogically. So I really want to thank you. So.
Well, yes, I want to reiterate my thanks, as you people say. I have a sort of a emotional feeling of gratitude in my heart for paying all this attention to this, and I hope it's been at least minimally useful for thinking about a lot of important problems.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us today. And I look forward to seeing many of you again for our next event on October 30th, Monday. Thank you all. Have a good day. And Steve, Peter, Rob, Jesse, thank you so very much for sharing your precious time. I learned a great deal from you all. Thank you.
Thanks,
We
Lynn.
will be in touch privately again. Bye, Steve. Everybody, take care. Take care.